about so welcome everybody, and thanks for your brief introductions. And today we are focusing on Jocey Quinn's new book, Invisible Education: Post-Human Explorations of Everyday Learning. And just to say that this is recorded and will be on the internet as a YouTube clip. So if you prefer to not have your face, your video on it, please also let George know if this is already too late. But you can just turn the video off, or also if you prefer to ask questions or say things through the chat, that's also fine. The whole idea of it is that this is part of the post-qualitative new materialist and critical post-humanist collective resource creation. So part of it, I don't know, George, would you like to share the website? And so here is the website for people who don't know it. This is part of the book series where Jocey's book is in, and what we do create to go with those books in the series are resources for people to use. So there's also Jocey's podcast that goes with the book. And say if you want to introduce your students or want to read more or want to hear the podcast, you can go there, but also any of the others. So it is a series with a difference in the sense that videos and images can be published on it to go with the actual physical book. And then we've got the pedagogical resource, as you can see here, is that when we have seminars or panels, special sessions, that they are here. You can see, oh, that's the one with Sylvia, and all the others, is that you can listen to this yourself, or you can use this for your teaching. We're starting with an online course in September next year, which is not as such accredited, or not yet anyway, but watch this space and you will be alerted to it. But the whole idea of it is that we have focused on this book this month, and in a reading group where people had read 3 different chapters. Chapter 1, if I'm not mistaken, which was 1, 3, and 4, wasn't it, that we did? Yeah. So each week we had 1 chapter, and people who were in the group generated questions, and it is those questions. So Jocey wasn't there because otherwise it very quickly becomes a question and answer session, which we didn't want. But really people just thinking about, what were those questions? How does this book make me think in particular ways about my own research, about my own work, about my own teaching? And so really opening up. And what we always do at the last session in the week, we pick up those questions. Now the author is here, and what we would like Jocey to do is engage with those questions and also with us, and we can ask questions and more questions and see, not necessarily answer the questions, but where else could I take those us? What else could happen with those questions? So it's not necessarily, again, in this case, a question and answer session, but just how, and so feel free. What we really would like us to all feel we can do is just have a conversation with the author. There's no template for it. Every session is very different, and yeah, we can just own it in our own particular way. But let me start with introducing Jocey, who's Professor of Lifelong Learning at Plymouth Institute of Education at the University of Plymouth in the UK. And her research is transdisciplinary and focused on marginalized adults and their learning. She's published widely and led many international and national research projects. And she's been working with post-human ideas for the past 10 years and is a joint coordinator of the Adventures in Posthumanism International Network, and also a network that has just submitted a manuscript for the series. So that's also really exciting, how that collective works. And you're organizing so much amazing, actually, sessions that unfortunately very much clashes with the reading group I do on a Wednesday. But maybe you also want to have the, say a little bit more about that network and the kind of a reading group that you do. But we have got these questions. We had loads of questions, and we had sort of put them together in 3 questions. George, if you wouldn't mind sharing those. We'll go through them. And oh, they're in the chat. Okay, great. So I'll read them out first. Go through them all 3, and then we just take them one by one and make sure that we have enough time for all 3 of them. So the first one is, in your book, there are rich metaphors such as trail, not quite flight, and concepts such as invisible, postverbal. Can you say more about how they can make us think differently about teaching and about learning? Then the second one, how does the binary between formal and informal work in your writing? And how does activism help us? Oh, maybe I didn't. How does the binary between formal in your writing work, and how does activism help us reconfigure a formal education? What hope can you give professionals working within formal education systems? I think that was in particular because it felt like for some, oh, what can I possibly do still within the formal system? So yeah, so I think that's when hope came up really as a possible a way forward to think about what is there, what is possible really. And then the last question is, can you elaborate how you position yourself within posthumanism? For example, your writing about the power of objects seems to differ from, for example, Karen Barad's agential realism. There was also a moment in your book where, that you say that you're critical of both humanism and posthumanism. And I think it would be really nice to open up a conversation really where you position yourself, even if that might not be the right verb to use. So the first question, I'm just looking at time. Let's maybe try a quarter of an hour for each of them and see where it takes us. The first one, in your book, there are rich metaphors such as trail, not quite flight, and concepts such as invisible, postverbal. Can you say a bit more about how they can make us think differently? About teaching and learning, I might not even be happy to call them metaphors.
Okay. Well, first of all, thanks to everybody for coming here today. It's really great to have people who are even interested in the book and want to read it and talk about it. I'm much more interested in hearing what you think than in hearing myself talk, but I will attempt to sort of work with these questions, which are interesting in various ways, particularly interesting to me in the emphasis that they have, which I think tells us a lot. And I'll explain a bit more about that as I go along. The first question that Karen has just mentioned was about metaphors. And that made me start to think a lot more about why am I writing and thinking in this way? Because to me, it has been and always has been quite a natural way of thinking. And there are lots of reasons for that, I think. One of them is my background, in that I started by studying literature. And so I was encouraged and trained to think about metaphors, to unpick metaphors, and to realize the power of metaphors. And to think that in a metaphor, you have 2 things coming together. You have something that is quite concrete in a sense, and the other meaning that is being revealed by that metaphor. And for me, that is always what I'm trying to work with, both the material and the immaterial at the same time. And that's what I do in the book, I think. There are other reasons as well. Another reason for this metaphorical approach is that I think we are all encouraged to live in metaphor and think in metaphor. If you look at media, you look at the way that people talk, there are all these cultural narratives, which are the ways that people evoke important things that are happening to them. So that quite often, we're not saying something totally new. We're drawing on a metaphor that circulates in our society and that we all understand and that we use, so that metaphorical thinking is natural for everybody. It's part of our daily lives. And the third thing that I thought about was how these metaphors that I work with in the book, they didn't come out of my head. They didn't spring just from idle thoughts of mine. They came from actually doing empirical research with other people. And to me, that's vitally important. I think I'll talk about that a bit more later on, but one of the problems that I have with posthumanism is the lack of empirical research often. And I think that I don't want to just evoke my thoughts. I want to engage with other people and find out how they are living and being in the world. And it's that engagement that produces these metaphors for me, and that then I can use them, hopefully, in a good way. So the question mentions a few particular ways that I'm talking and why are they useful. I'm finding it, all of the questions seem to be leading back to issues of teaching and learning, formal education, and in a way, this is what I'm trying to avoid. The book is really about something else, but I understand that that's where we are, that we're working in universities, this is what we're interested in. So obviously these are the kind of questions that we might want to ask. But in a way, I think it tends to reify the way that we already work, which is something I'm trying to break out of. So the invisible education, which is kind of the central metaphor, if you want to call it metaphor, of the book, works in different ways. One is that what I'm saying is that everyday learning, the kind of learning that is inspired by everyday questions and engagements with all different forms of matter, is so natural. It's almost like the air we breathe. We can't see it, but it's there. It's always there. So that's part of the invisibility. But the invisibility also means that it can disrupt. It can take us away into non-normalized ways of thinking and being, and move things around in the formal space. And it's also invisible because it's something that is ignored. So you could use the word invisibilized more than invisible, in that it's made to be invisible. And one of the reasons why I wanted to write the book was that I was seeing all these different kinds of education in people's lives that were just not recognized. They were often actively disavowed. People would say, oh no, they don't exist. People are not learning in this way. Take the example of the young people that I talk about who were engaging in landscapes with animals. And that was where their learning experiences were happening, in their everyday engagements in life. Whereas in school, they were learning absolutely nothing. But sometimes when I present that idea and that experience to people in formal settings, they refuse to believe that this was actually happening at all. And I'm interested in the reasons why people do not want to admit that people are learning outside of formal spaces. So the invisible, I think, really disrupts our idea of why the formal classroom has to be the way it is, why only education is only assumed to happen in those kind of regulated spaces. It also helps us to think, you know, if we're thinking about our own work as teachers and learners, how do we bring into the formal space the learning that is happening that is not being recognized? It disrupts, and it should disrupt, what we assume to be important, because it's not seen and it is beyond the beyond of what's happening there. So one of the other metaphors that you talk about is the trail, which I use when I'm talking about activists. The particular activists that I did research with were people from Occupy London. And originally I wanted to think about life history, working with them on life history, but I realized very soon that this was not right. This was individualized, whereas in fact what was happening was communal, co-created across different relations. And then therefore that I'd identified different trails that people might follow and might at different points in their lives, and then move away, move back. Some might be more important than others at different times. And I used the metaphor of the trail in two ways, I think. Well, one is that it's a path that has been created by the way people move across the landscape. It's not a formal road or lane. It's something that has been made by people's movement on the earth. And it's also something that people have made together, and people can follow together. They can walk down the trail that other people have helped to lay for them. But at the same time, I'm thinking about the trail in terms of contrails in the sky, something that is just happens quickly and then disappears. But it's important and it matters. And it might not last, it doesn't last at that moment, but it has some sort of resonance that persists. So if you think about the trail in terms of teaching and learning, communally we're creating paths that people can follow. And they might be very different paths than the ones that are laid down formally in the university, for example. And we have to see that people are sometimes inspired by following lots of different trails at the same time, or may move off one and onto another. So it's about flexibility, commonality, permanence, but also evanescence as well. And the last metaphor that you picked up on was postverbal. I don't think you read the chapter which was about the work that we did on Beyond Words, which was a big research project with people who don't speak but communicate in other ways. And we created this idea of the postverbal to get away from the idea of non-verbal, which seems pejorative, and it's all about lack and deficit. But the people that we were working with, say people with autism, dementia, brain injury, stroke, were still communicating in other ways, by touch, by sight, by movement. And that, you know, in our ways of thinking about the human, we totally privilege the verbal. We have, you know, if you ask people what makes a human, they very often say words. Being able to speak is what makes someone human. So if you don't speak, does that mean that you're not human? Why, you know, why are words considered to be so crucial? And I think if you think about the classroom, speaking and being articulate is totally valorized. And we may have students who don't speak, don't want to speak, can't speak. It doesn't mean that they're not trying to communicate in different ways. And we should respect that and break down our idea of what it is to be a good, educated person who can always articulate what they want to say. So I think, excuse me, the metaphors can be useful, can help in teaching and learning, but really what I was interested in was how I explain and understand everyday learning rather than teaching and learning in formal spaces.
Wow. Thank you, Jocey. That's it's very incredibly helpful, but also generates so many other questions. I'm just going to, yeah, and I see some nodding. So let me just have open that up for people also who asked the question, just to say that the direct reference to the trail was on page 64. And, you know, with a slightly compare, I can see now listening to what you're saying, how different that is from a flight as a line of flight in Deleuze and Guattari. But yeah, that generates so many other ideas. Let's open it up. Who would like to take it from here? Either a question or comment, or maybe just resonates.
Excuse me.
Definitely really very helpful if I just think back of what we discussed during the reading groups. And even if you weren't there, that's also fine, you know, how does this lovely, yeah, go on.
Yeah, thank you so much for introducing this beautiful work. I was not in reading groups and I didn't read book yet, but just the question that comes while listening to you. I think this dominant system is very rewarding, at least what I experienced and in my closest surrounding. So if people manage to compromise, you know, and to fit into this very rigid systems, they are constantly rewarded. And I think it's like an addiction. It's like getting ticket from one room to other one without really having any space to reflect even what I am doing in the system. And these methods that you are bringing in, I still feel that they are for people that's non-fitting at some point, or don't fit from the beginning, or fail out of the system at some point, like they stay in the margins. So my question would be, how can we create more space in formal education systems that these different ways of learning, yeah, could get more attention and possibilities to be brought in, not just for those people who are in peripheries already pushed because of very different reasons, but just, yeah, to see value of it. And yeah, maybe how we as researchers, of course, we are looking all for these ways, but there's always constant barriers because, yeah, that this dominant system takes so much space, and as long as it holds, yeah, it fights for own position. So maybe what would be, I don't know, creative ways or all possible ways to bring this work into formal curriculums, and not only in human sciences or social sciences, but also like in natural sciences, where they are very valuable, these different ways of learning and different forms of learning.
Yeah, mean, that is crucial. What you're saying is crucial and so important to me as well. And what I really am interested in is the people who are on the margins, and who are stuck on the margins. I think even recognizing that marginal positions are still learning positions, and that people are still learning every day, even if you don't recognize it, is a really big step, because you're giving respect, you're trying to understand how that works, you're trying to bring that into the university, for example. So it's not easy, but I think there are pedagogic ways that you can start to address some of these things. So, for example, take for example people living with dementia, who are assumed that they're past learning, they can't learn anymore. But in our research, we found that through music, it was revealed that they could learn even at the most advanced stages. So creative impulses like music that bypass some of the things that are usually valorized can be really productive, I think, in the formal space. But the other thing, the most important thing, I think, is when you have students that come into the university who are not seen as successful, trying to work with them about what they are doing that is successful outside of the university, the kind of spaces where they feel they have got mastery, where they have got some kind of success, and bringing that into your work with them in the classroom, respecting what they do in their everyday life and trying to build on that. So, I mean, it's not rocket science. It's not totally new to say those things, but I think that we don't do it. People are not doing it as much as they might do. I don't see myself as a pedagogue, mostly. I'm more interested in the research side of things, I think. So I couldn't make any great claims about how you would use that in the classroom. But I think that the most important thing is to say it exists, it's there, it's happening all the time, everywhere. So how do we make those bridges across? And how do we start to say it's not, we don't say what happens in the university or the classroom is the most important thing. You don't even have to have that. There are other ways of learning.
That's very helpful, because I think I haven't appreciated enough that maybe your proposal, one of the proposals, is to start from everyday learning. So when we think in terms of inclusion, have we lost? Oh no, there you are. You've just moved. For everyday learning, if we use that as a starting point, rather than that we start with what's learning or what's teaching, and how can we include maybe people who are post-verbal or so the starting point, I don't think I've appreciated that enough. Your starting point is what's everyday learning, and also how the metaphors might help. But let's have a look. Charlotte, you would like to come in?
Yeah, just building on what you were saying there, I found it really interesting, and I must admit this was from your concluding chapter. So I read the book after the reading group, just kept going with it. But one of the things that I thought, or that I wrote in my margins, was, do we want to make the invisible visible when it's doing such a powerful thing by disrupting the status quo as it is? You mentioned, and it was such an, I sat and paused over it because I thought, how do we do that? So it's invisible, and earlier on you said that it's also invisibilized, like that idea of it's been forced into being invisible rather than necessarily choosing to be that way. But I thought about that and the way in which, when it's invisible, but we're aware of it, it's super powerful. Whereas I wonder if we put or reveal it and welcome these things, and I'm not saying that we shouldn't, just for clarification, if it would perhaps do some damage to its power, its potential, and therefore not have the disrupting factor. And is there risk of the lady who spoke before me saying that it becomes another form of addiction? It becomes another way in which we grasp hold of something, and much like creativity in primary school, we grab hold of creativity and then we completely destroy it because we force creativity to be something that we then measure. And how do we stop it being a victim of almost its own, I want amazingness, but that's really not a word I'm looking for. I'm not sure that was a question.
It's an amazing remark and really made me think. Yeah, there is virtue in being invisible, in that you can, things can move around and do dangerous things without anybody knowing. And there could be a problem, as you say, if you make the invisible visible. So it's a really important point, I think. But I suppose I'm also interested, and we'll talk about it later, I think, about inequalities and structures, that there are different things going on at the same time. So we have the sort of magical, the invisible, the ineffable, but we also have the boundaries and the structures that stop things from happening.
Yeah.
I don't think the invisible education is totally free. I don't think it can sort of totally disrupt everything because we live in a boundaried world. So recognizing it in a way is maybe one way of sort of working against those boundaries, rather than just letting them carry on as they are. But I don't have a good answer to that point, and I'm glad you said it because it's making me think a lot. So thank you.
Yeah, and I think in particular, there's Jennifer left a message. I'm sorry, I now unexpectedly need to leave, but this is so relevant to what I'm doing and interested in paying attention to. I will be looking at the book and watch this later. I absolutely love switching the conversation to everyday learning and kind of ignoring the schoolroom for a bit. And I'm also, as you were saying this, and Charlotte, you too, it's just I was thinking about the people in the room here and how, especially in our work with very young children, maybe we can say pre-verbal or, whatever ridiculous terms we can come up with, but how, in the sense of very young children, how the everyday learning is the starting point, and to what extent even that whole yeah, maybe this really resonates with some of you in the room where you say, yeah, but this is my very starting point. I was wondering, Sylvia, whether you would want to say something about that. Maybe Lisa as well. Yeah, go on.
For me, so yeah, I haven't read the book, but I'm fascinated. I will read it. About the idea of invisible education and also the post-verbal. I haven't heard that before, and I think it's quite incredible to think differently about the verbal, but it also because I have a deep interest in this. My son was born with quite extensive disabilities, and so I have been rooted in this for years about the way of learning that happens in inarticulate ways, but the visible and the invisible, I'm really interested in that. And also, how do we make it visible? It isn't just whether we do or whether we don't, but it's also the how, because words can only do so much, I think. So the arts, I think, and that's actually what I've just been writing about, the idea of working with the atmospheric, the felt, the sense things, and then beginning to stitch it into this long mystery cloth. And how you can make something felt and visible but not articulate, to me, is really interesting, because then it leaves a bit of mystery to it. It means you have to be drawn in a different kind of way, and it doesn't come across in an explanatory, this is that kind of way. So I'm fascinated. I will read your book.
Thank you.
Okay. Anybody else before we? No. Wow. Okay, because it would be good anyway to move on to the other questions, although we have in many different ways, actually, is almost these lines have been yeah, but it's almost like in a quite an animalistic way. The second question was, how does the binary between formal and informal work in your writing? So, you know, I don't know, maybe you would like to add something to what you've said before about this, and how does activism help us reconfigure formal education? And I think especially the activism, which is so strong in your work and in your writing, how that works. But and then the hope, because you already sort of talked a little bit about what hope can you give professionals working within formal education system. And I think in a way you've answered that, but maybe you would like to say a little bit more about any of these aspects of the second question.
Okay. Yeah, I think that we've touched on some of those things in a different way already, but they are all connected, of course. Again, you know, this question about formal and informal and reverting to that language is something that I was trying to get away from, actually, in the book, very consciously, for lots of different reasons, because I think the field of informal learning is there's good scholarship there, but it's not very well theorized. It needs a lot more work to understand, you know, what is actually happening. But also the very concept of informal means you're measuring it against the formal. So it's always in that frame. So I'm confused now. I've got a huge picture of myself in front of me, which is awful. So please don't do that.
I'm so sorry. I put you on the spotlight. I'm sorry. I'll take it off.
No, it's okay. I'm just being
No.
being silly. But no.
This is perfect. Fine.
Yeah. So I think that yeah, I don't. As I say, I'm trying to get away from those terms and find a different language, which is why I use the idea of invisible education. Because, you know, when we talk about formal and informal, it's always implicit. The formal is the education. The formal is what matters and is the education, and the informal is sort of by the by, it's extra. And so that was why I wanted to escape all of that altogether and think differently. But if you know, I think anybody that works in any kind of education knows that there is not a strict boundary between formal and informal. So that in a university, for example, all sorts of things are happening in relation outside of the actual classroom. The relation that the student has with the buildings, with the university, with the location, geographical location, civic location, the relations amongst people, not just academics, but all different kinds of people in the university space, are all constituting what, the education that somebody has. So it's not a fixed divide. But of course, as I was saying before, what I want to think about is all of that is outside. And Moten and Harney's idea of beyond the beyond. So beyond the beyond of education is something else. Beyond the beyond of education with a capital E. But I wanted to use the word education. I didn't want to say invisible learning, because I wanted to stress that this form of learning is just as formative, just as important, in lots of ways much more important than what happens in the university or in schools, in the so-called formal spaces. And I think that, we all know that the formal is becoming even more formalized. It's becoming more rigid, as one of the colleagues said. It's a competition. Everybody has to follow the rules. Everybody is in a precarious position. I think we all know that certainly in the UK, there's mass redundancies in universities. So everybody is towing the line. And so the formal becomes a straitjacket, really. And I suppose this is where the activism and the hope comes in that while that is happening, there are still cracks in the system. There are still little openings that people can use and do use. We all have those kind of relations that we have with people that we know think differently and act differently. And we can operationalize them, and we can do something with them. If you look at the research with the activists, one of the things that I really wanted to look at was what happens once the action is over. So I was doing research with people who've been involved in Occupy, but several years on from Occupy. So did it still have meanings? Did it still have impact? And one of the interesting things was, yes, it still was in the world. It hadn't died. It hadn't totally disappeared. It was still making connections, making relationships. Looking at the activism and the way that people experienced it, it was not an individualistic experience. It was a communal experience. That was built together. And I think that's a hopeful thing in terms of the university needing to build things together and not in this spirit of competition and individualism. So we can learn a lot from activism. And we can learn a lot about how people make connections from different kinds of things and different kinds of people, objects. People in the research made a lot of connections with the actual tent city university, which was the tent erected in London, where people did invisible education within that space. And that showed that it was possible to do education otherwise in a different kind of space. And again, that's, that has some interesting learning for what we might do in the university, in the concrete university. And another important aspect, and something that I've always been very interested in, is how activism permeates into other spaces. So we could say, if we look at feminism, for example, in lots of ways, feminism has permeated the university in terms of disciplines, in terms of the way people think. But at the same time, the university has appropriated feminism and perhaps, taken it and diffused it in lots of different ways. So if we're looking for where radical ideas come from, where intellectual ideas come from it's not from the university, it's from activist spaces. That is where new thoughts, better thoughts come from. And then eventually over time, they can percolate and permeate the university. So the hopeful thing is that activism can make a difference, and can change ideas about knowledge, ideas about what's important. I think, yeah, it's really, really difficult to have a hopeful space at the moment with the world as it is, and the things that are happening, the genocide. It's really very, very difficult to have hope. But if we don't have hope, we haven't got anything. And I am a very optimistic person at heart. And I do think, you know, we have a duty to be involved in activism of different kinds. You know, if activism is acting for change or for a better world, then, you know, it's something that we all have to do. But we can do it in different ways. It doesn't have to be from being on the street. It can be, it's about changing ideas about what's important and what's valuable, and what counts in the world.
It reminds me actually of a chapter that you wrote together with Carol Taylor and Azealia Franklin Phipps. In the second book in this series called Navigating the Post-Qual New Materials and Critical Post-Humanist Terrain Across Disciplines, and especially the way it's using, or thinking about, it's called Rethinking Research Use. And you know, you give so many examples in that chapter of activism and people's work and how that works to do exactly that. And I hadn't really thought of that chapter, but some beautiful examples of how that can work, you know, within academia. I mean, this is about research and not maybe necessarily teaching, but anyway, it's anyone who would like to comment, and just also to say that Judith Crowther, and this is I don't know whether you want to say something. Okay, I'll hand over to you in a minute, James, but what George has put in is that Judith uses the term /formal, and maybe we can hang on to that one for the third and last question, because that is a / from Barad. Now, from Barad, and put to use with informal, and how it might work and might work differently. But let's go to Jane first.
Yeah, I just wanted to say, firstly, I'm really glad that I tuned in today. And secondly, I also haven't read the book, but I am definitely going to. I'm just sitting here nodding and scribbling away. And there's just so much that you're saying, Jocey, that resonates with work that I'm currently doing. And I've shared a paper with you, the snail paper, but that particular project with 4-year-olds, working with arts-based methods to try to create other spaces where there's not the possibility of getting things wrong, and for children to explore genuinely through the feltness, which resonates with what Sylvia was saying, has been just massively transformative in rethinking what's possible, and also kind of building on a number of people in this room. But, you know, how we think about post-verbal, pre-verbal, the ways in which it's possible to be in the world that privileges another mode of engagement, and how we can learn with and from. And I'm just thinking right now, I'm in the midst of starting a new paper, and the project that I'm talking about was young children and mini beasts, so insects. And I've written a paper on snails, and I'm just about to write one on spidering and spiders. And so when you start to think about spiders and the way that they are in the world, and that they only can encounter and sense the world in relation to the web, and it's about vibrations, and it's not about privileging of visual optics, and the readiness with which pre-verbal children, many with special educational needs, took that up and embraced, you know, spidering and encountering the world through this kind of spidering sensibility. So that's kind of taking me to Delaney's stuff around Wanderlines, and you're probably familiar with that work, Jocey, but it's I'm desperate to read your book because it just totally fits into what I'm grappling with now around and I love this stuff about the visible, invisible, and that seems to, and you mentioned Motten and Harney and the undercommons, and you know, it just feels like it's a really exciting moment to kind of rethink and re-engage with what we even consider learning to be, or community to be, or experiencing the world. And I just think it's just so inspiring. So it's not really a question, it's just a very big thank you, and just the serendipity that I should tune in today and learn about this amazing work that you're doing. And I'm madly searching for not just the book, but anything else you've written. So I don't know if you've got other links to the various projects that you're talking about, but it's just really, really exciting stuff. So thank you.
Thank you, Jane. That's wonderful. Thanks very much. It's great.
Because it really makes you sort of pause in a very important political way. How we use our concepts, and you know, the verbal for starters, and yeah, Vitalia.
Yes, I am coming with questions that just pop up from our conversation, and how, Jane, that you talked about spiders. So I'm working with methods that are both for adults, maybe more for adults, but also involves children. And of course, children, they have naturally still not lost capacity to pay attention and to notice these very small things. But now with stress decreasing, mindfulness, forest bathing, we offer possibilities for people to slow down and to start to notice things like the spider nets. And I think it's really beautiful work. But then, there are these spaces of learning, and then there's this everyday reality that we can, speak in this learning space, how wonderful spiders are. And then child comes home, and he notices spider net. And next day there was cleaning action in home, and everything is eliminated. And same goes for adults. I think once we kind of regain this capacity of noticing life around, we also notice how much destruction is going on, and how we are damaging, intentionally or unintentionally, but we participate in this damaging of life every day. So my question is, how to cope also, with this learning that we are inviting people to notice about fragility of life and multiplicity of life, and also ongoing, destruction, like even sometimes that we have no control. Like I am observing, plants and all creatures that live in the city, and then there's this municipality, how they manage, this nature. Just one day, everything is gone, So I think what learning we can offer, also coping with what we are losing, every day, because we are losing enormous amounts of life. What kind of, way of living we have in our cities and in our society, that is also largely is out of our, way of changing it, because there are these strong structures of destruction.
That's a comment, I guess. And maybe Jocey or someone else would like to comment on.
Well, first of all, I just want to pick up on the image of the spider and the web, because in the research that we did with people living with dementia and the book that we wrote about it, Lifelong Learning and Dementia, we talked about how some of the people with dementia sort of moved like spiders, moved across the room, not in a direct way, but indirect ways, and made kind of webs with other people, but with objects, in the care homes, for example, where they lived. So I think that this image of the web and the spider is very fertile one, and I can see, you know, from what you both said, that in your own research it's going to bring so much. But sorry.
No, I think someone is coughing.
Okay. And the other, you know, the huge issue that you raise, Susanna, about care and about how we cope with the destruction of the world around us. What can we say? You know, we are all in it. We're all enmeshed in that. And we're all suffering from it because there is ongoing destruction of our world. But I think some of these things about, you know, affective learning, embodied learning, post-verbal learning, as somebody said before, about different ways about being in the world, help us to have a different kind of respect. And we can work from that respect and encourage other people to have that respect for relations with animals, insects, spaces, landscapes, and that's a part of learning. That's a part of everyday learning. It's not something separate. So we're in the world, we're of the world, and we're learning with the world. And I think that this, well, I think that a focus and a recognition of this everyday learning is a positive thing that can help us to cope with the anxiety and the loss that we're all experiencing. You know, we can work against it. We can respond, but not by doing things in the way that the formal spaces want us to do it. By being different, by working differently, and communally, not individualistically.
Okay, so that leads us nicely to the last question about and thanks. Yeah, I think Jane, there's a request to share the writing on spiders. You're in the midst of writing and now. Okay, great. So we'll look out for that one. But I think, you know, the oh gosh, now I've lost the thread about, oh yeah, learning with the world and, you know, your positioning in posthumanism, which brings us also back to what you started off with, beautifully talking about metaphors and how they work for you and how they work for you differently. And, you know, lots of posthumanists would say that metaphors are maybe representational, they're about the world, maybe not with the world, but obviously your take on metaphors is differently. So it would be fascinating to hear more about that. And you know, in the way about so the informal as well, what George was referring to in Judith's work is how the cutting together apart, the / works in Barad's work, where it disrupts a possible binary between informal and formal, and actually one only exists, like maybe what Jane was talking about with the spider and the spider web. One doesn't exist without the other, and in the same way that formal and informal doesn't exist without the other. And I also thought in terms of hope, like what Bardotti talks about, how the study is doing some amazing work within like the humanities, and how in academia, at least, the studies do that very political and disruptive work. Although, you know, you also add a lot of caution to that, how they can also be become part of that. Maybe not so, yeah. Anyway, so you've got child studies and gender studies, and doing that work according to Barad. So maybe you can say a little bit more, elaborate on your on how you position yourself within posthumanism and humanism, and yeah, maybe leave it at that. I've said enough.
Okay. Okay, well, I will try to do that. I don't see myself as a pure posthumanist, even if there is such a thing. I don't think there probably isn't. And I think that it's really a catch-all term in lots of ways, an umbrella that lots of different people with different positions kind of shelter under that term, I think. And as I said before, I'm critical of posthumanism as well as humanism, really. I see lots of problems in both situations. I think that I've come to posthumanism via feminism, really, which is my grounding, I suppose, in intellectual grounding and activist grounding. And in feminism, I think we've always, well, the feminism that I've been involved in, been aware that everything is a construct, that the world is constructed in a masculinist way, constructed in a white, middle class, ableist, heterosexual frame. But this is not natural, it's not normal, it's just a construct. So, that position, I think a lot of people have got that position, and, to critique that normalized vision is something that's quite been going on for so long in lots of different disciplines. It's nothing new about that. But I think in terms of posthumanism, it takes it that a bit further, in that saying that the idea that there is any such thing as a human is a critical point. The idea that there might be a human of any kind that is different, qualitatively different from any other form of material, is the problem, and it is the biggest construct of all, really. And I do sort of move to that position, and I think posthumanism also helps you to think more about relations, not just with people, but with other forms of matter, brings that more into relation, landscapes and animals and objects and so on. But I think I do differ from people like Barad, if I can make that bold claim. I find it very inspiring, the idea of interaction and the creation of new worlds. And part of my theorizing of invisible education is that it's about the total permanent generation of new learning worlds all the time. But I don't see those new worlds as being totally free. I see them as bounded. I see them as having very strong limits to them. And that's because of the structures and the inequalities that have been created through humanism. So what I'm really interested in is the inequalities caused by humanism. That is my key focus, really. And I suppose that's different than a lot of people. And I'm also very much wedded to empirical research, for good or ill. For me, it's really, really important. And I'm very suspect of quite a lot of post-human research, in that it's not doing that kind of work. And I know that, there's different ways of thinking about the empirical, and that's probably, but what I mean by that is you're engaging with others, you're engaging with how other people and other things perceive the world. And you're learning through that. That is what generates new ideas. That's what generates new understanding. I'm not familiar with the in/formal concept. And I kind of feel a strong resistance to it, I must admit, because I don't think the slash in itself does enough to move us away from the way that we tend to think about it, and that we need a different language, which is what I'm interested in. So they're the different ways I think. The metaphor question is a very interesting one, because I don't see a metaphor as totally representing. I think it's bringing together material and immaterial factors, and yoking them together in a way that we can understand, and that we do, and that people do all the time. And that's what I'm interested in. I'm very much interested in the materials of life, but also the immaterial, the things, the uncanny, the things that you can't see, the things that are always there, but at the corner of the eye. I think those things to me are very important. So I'm well aware that it's, there's lots of incommensurabilities within that, but that's where I am. That's my position, I think, if I have a position.
Okay, I'm going to I'm fascinated by so much what you're saying, and it generates so many other questions about the empirical, for example, and I saw quite a few people thinking, oh, I mean, but their bodies may be, oh, okay, so is that for you empirical? So maybe that, but there is because sort of hybrid, yeah. I mean, I think maybe Susanna, we talked about that maybe earlier on. Finn, Jocey, I'm interested in the invisible learning that happens through relations with more than humans, especially the uncanny things that are perhaps not noticed by most verbal humans. Thank you for writing to that. I'd be interested if you have any advice in how to do research within that area. So you mentioned the uncanny just now. Invisible learning that happens through relation with more than humans, especially the uncanny things that are maybe not noticed. Maybe we can put that in relation to the empirical, how you would do that empirically.
I think, well, if you think about the research with people living with dementia, if I sit in my room and write about what I think it's like living with dementia, that takes me a very short way. But if I go out and actually engage and work with people living with dementia, then I can explore with them much more. And so in that is where partly the uncanny really comes out, because if people living with dementia are very seem to be very attuned to other things that a lot of people would not notice. Their attention seems to be taken with something else, another dimension, because they perhaps it is to do with being post-verbal and moving beyond the limits of language, means that they seem to be attuned to something else, some other kind of messages. Now, how you research that is not easy, not easy at all. You can't say, I know what the uncanny is. You can't measure it, or even, you can't know what it is. But you can see that people are acting as if they are responding to something uncanny, or in any kind of research, you can say there's something going on that is not totally visible, not speakable, and we're attuned to that. So that's the best I think that we could hope for, really, in researching that. But again, I think in the book I've used a lot of poetry, fiction, art, because those kinds of, I call them knowledge resources, knowledge sources, they are more in tune with uncanny things, with invisible things, and therefore are really useful resources to draw on, I think. And I've always found that really helpful to me, to be reading all those kinds of things at the same time as doing research.
I was really touched by what you were saying about the indirect in the context of people with dementia. So anecdotal, but my mother, when I gave her a teddy bear for her birthday, and the immediate response was that, and Winnicott would have so much very interesting to say about that. Immediately, she had a dialogue with the teddy bear for about 20 minutes, and she was enacting, so she was in role with the teddy bear. And I haven't heard her speak for so long, and also totally couldn't follow what she was saying, but she was in her own world. And so that, the communication there and what it does to you and how it affects you, and all the questions that it provokes about knowing and attuning to, and what's going on, and grasping, and how limited our understanding is of situations like that. Very moving what you're saying, actually. I'm aware of time, as always. As I said in the beginning, but it seems we have so much time for this conversation, but we always run out of time. And I don't know whether anyone has got maybe a word or a verb or anything to share, to express your appreciation, or how it has affected you to this conversation. And then there is that can be then followed by George saying a little bit about what's happening next month. Or you might also use gestures. Emoticons, or oh, that's wonderful. The balloons. From Polly, thank you a lot. There was a lot of food for thought also for our project.
If I may, in BSL, as someone that also has post-verbal moments, your book's given me that.
Thank you. From Finn, many thanks for your response. It was really helpful, and warm regards. And yeah, it's nice, Finn, to hear that, because you were there in the reading group, and we hope that more of you will join us for the reading group next month, and it will be the last one for this year. And then we'll pick it up in February, where we're actually going to workshop the glossary, which is one of the books in the series. And George has put in the chat, gosh, I can't keep up with this, their email address. Yeah.
I put my email address in the chat if anyone would like to join our reading group. please just send me an email and we can start the process. And then also next month we'll be reading Bodying Post-qualitative Research by Nicole Land, which is another book in the series. So we'll have the same process of reading 3 chapters over 3 weeks and then having a sort of webinar in the last week. And then, as Karen said, we are doing the glossary at the beginning of next year, which will look a bit different. I mean, we'll communicate more about it, but basically it's going to be more of like workshopping rather than a reading group. So that's really exciting. So yeah, please stay tuned.
And also, if you yourself, would like to have, that we read your work, or someone that we would really resonate with, and George is the person to contact. Lisa's really excited to hear some of the ideas that I take for granted in early childhood education being discussed in wider and broader context. Absolutely. And to hear from others also working in EC. Thank you for this conversation. I think especially because you're working in the Radio Amelia setting, it's so, I still can't understand how little that is known outside early childhood education, and how much actually that has to offer other phases of education, and do I dare say formal and informal education. So thank you very much. Thank you in particular, George, for your incredible work for this collective, and have a good evening, afternoon, wherever you are in this world, and hope to see you next month.
Thank you.
And thank you. Oh, maybe, Jocey, have you got a little bit of moment for a warm down after this?
Sure, yeah. I've just left my email in the chat because somebody wanted it.
Oh, lovely.
If it's there.